You're listening to 4CRB's interviews and talkback series.
Well, it's a very good morning and welcome to the microphone to Supreme Court Judge David Ashton Willis. I have to take a pause there for a moment.
You always pause on that.
The R hits the tongue and I go, no,
he's not retired. No.
Well, we were going to talk about forgiveness this morning, and I think we should still continue to talk about forgiveness, but you wanted to make some comment about Bondi and what's transpired
well, let's
there.
just look, I'll just make a quick comment, and it would be good if people would think during the week, and maybe, well, no, next Thursday's Anzac Day, so will we be look, that's right, I just remembered there's no show next Thursday because the day is attributed to remembering those who've served. And so I will be in Fiji the following day, and I'll be there till the 11th of May, whatever that date is, and then we'll do it again. And just to repeat, I'll only be home for about 3 weeks in May, and then I've got to go back for the June sittings of the Supreme Court. So, but we will do this at that time, and I think what's happened over the weekend in Bondi, as well as with that Assyrian Coptic bishop being stabbed in his church as he was giving a sermon, they're really giving us in Australia pause for thought. Pause for thought in two areas. One, when there are people who are quite clearly known to be suffering mental illness, how many of them should be able just to continue to live amongst the community? Because 6 innocent people who are doing nothing other than shopping on Saturday, and 2 of them, one a 28-year-old beautiful young woman, and the other a young Chinese student in the country, here studying. And parents now have to be told their daughter is dead, all because of a person with a severe mental illness and a long history of it. He was 39 and known, was still in the community. Should he have been there? That's the question. The other one is this young man who attacked the bishop in the Assyrian Coptic Church in Sydney and used words such as, don't insult my religion. Now, we know what that religion is, so that raises the question, which we should look at in future shows, and given that we're bringing 100,000 people virtually a month into this country, from vast and different backgrounds, I support multiculturalism, but I support it in the sense that they make a clear commitment to learning and becoming part of this culture. Because I heard a good journalist state recently, when you bring one person in, you bring their culture in. And that probably is true until that person is married, had children, and usually down to the 3rd generation. So I'd like us to give thought on that, and those listening, give thought on those 2 things. Should we need to review mental health? Because you can't have 6 innocent people doing nothing other than going shopping, losing their lives because some mentally affected person carries a knife, runs around and stabs them to death. Okay. And then the last one is, should we be more aware that when we bring in people from disparate ethnicities and cultures, to be aware that they're not just the person coming, they bring their culture with them.
Look, there's some considerations there, and again, the mental health aspect is something that we do need to do better with, especially if someone is psychotic and chanting at trees, we're holding onto 6 hunting knives.
Yes.
All the telltale signs are there that this person is doing the wrong thing and has the potential to do the wrong thing and involve other people.
Yes.
Again, we need to consider what we can be doing, not dealing with knives in the first instance and wanding, and I still think those are good ideas, but you're never going to stop the knife component for the fact that you can wander into the shopping centre and walk into Kmart and say, I'm buying a cooking knife, and off you go. So to me, it is more about dealing with the root cause, and if someone has a long diagnosed mental illness, there needs to be more done.
Well, but only if it's a mental illness that is potentially life-threatening to others. Some people have mental illnesses that affect them, but they would not harm.
Sure.
And again, some people of different cultures come in and would no more want to attack, or
Sure.
We are a multicultural, multi-religious, multi-ethnic society. But there are some who simply will not adjust to that. And we need to be looking very carefully, more carefully at those we bring in and invite into the country. And we've had to face that with refugees.
Yes.
Well, we should be facing it much more deeply now with people who apply to migrate
Yes.
and are accepted. I, again, can only say that governments are failing. They simply have failed to protect the citizenry. I've said this on past shows, that because of youth crime being at the level it is, because of these two incidents over the last week, or week and a bit, it's a clear indication, government, you are failing to protect our community, the citizenry, and your first obligation is to protect the citizenry. Treat those who can't be amongst the citizenry or who shouldn't be amongst the citizenry. Now, I remember years ago there was a real hard push in the area of mental illness that the best way to treat people suffering mental is to put them into the community. And I doubted that then, and I spoke on it 40 years ago as a barrister. It's a lovely ideal, but to put everyone in the community, and I realise they weren't putting everyone, but I think back, 5 years ago, that Sikh bus driver in Brisbane.
Yes.
He'd migrated to Australia. He was an engineer, I think, in India, but his engineering qualifications were not sufficient, so he was doing this job, driving buses and studying to bring himself up to the Australian standard so he could practice. I think he was a civil engineer. And yet a 47-year-old man on that bus who had severe mental disability travelled regularly on the bus, but one day decided, for whatever the reason was in his mind, and he stabbed this man to death. And this man, a genuine innocent man, here with his family seeking to make a new life, suffers at the hands of a 47-year-old person who, the more information came out that I was advised on, he should never have been allowed in the public domain.
And that is the battle right
That
there,
is,
isn't it?
yes.
So, all right.
Well, maybe that ties into, because I heard earlier this morning that Bishop Marie has forgiven the young man, and he made the lovely statement, I think Martin Luther King made it. You can't overcome darkness with darkness. You can't overcome evil with evil. And as Bishop Marie said, you can't overcome evil with evil, whether he'd picked it up from Martin Luther King. The only way you can overcome evil is with love.
Yes.
Now, who would argue against that? But sometimes love may impinge on what we've just been speaking about. Young people from different ethnicities and different cultures come here. To love them properly is to make it clear, you join this society or we will deport you. You will go back to where you have come from, because you can't add anything to this society. Or the same with a mentally ill person. I don't know whether any of the families have forgiven him, and one can understand, some inability. I knew there were a lot of Jewish people in Melbourne, and I went to school with Jewish boys and their families, and in the 60s you met parents and grandparents who had tattoos on their wrist. And I met quite a number of Melbourne Jewish citizens who said the only way I could go on in my life, and that one of them was in Dachau, the other one was in Auschwitz, and said I was only saved from being gassed and then exterminated by the Red Army. Their tanks were within about 5 miles.
Yes.
And we woke up one morning and found the camp empty of German troops. And within about an hour and a half, these massive Russian tanks rolled up to the gate. And I've walked through that gate. I've seen the photographs there of the Jewish children. But these two members of the Jewish, and both women, said the only way that they could go on in life and become a normal woman, a normal wife, and a normal mother was to forgive.
Yes. Oh, we're moving into forgiveness, are we, David?
I think we are.
Okay.
You missed my earlier segue.
Okay, I obviously did. I think I was trying to get us there, but anyway.
No, well, you did get us there.
All right. Well, forgiveness. It was led on from last week's love comments and love discussion. Where do you want to start?
Wherever you choose to start.
Well, it's a process, really, forgiveness, isn't it? It's not something you can just mouth the words and it actually happen, because usually if we take that example of what transpired to those Jewish women, it was a very, very hard situation. They often saw people that they loved pass away or be killed in front of them, and to be able to forgive those people of their transgressions is a big ask indeed.
Well, I think you were right when you said forgiveness is really not just one act, it's a process.
Yes.
Now, those Jewish women, I was speaking to them in the early and mid-70s in Melbourne, and I knew that the both of them had come to Australia in 1947 on ships bringing Jewish people from formerly occupied Nazi Europe. And they obviously, in 1947, had gone through 4 years before, their experiences at Dachau and at Auschwitz. So obviously on a ship coming to a new world, a new country, a new life, a new start, meant they had to obviously think about the experiences that they'd witnessed, that they had gone through, and had to realise, how do I start a new life if I carry all the baggage of hatred? Now, I've got a perfect example. In 1964, we had, for the first time since the Second World War, 2 Japanese naval destroyers visit Australia. And they spent time in Brisbane, in Sydney, and in Melbourne on a goodwill visit. And I can remember at the time the RSL saying, it's too early. There are still men and women alive who were in Japanese prisoner of war camps. We will still have men who are on the Burma Railway. That they should not be allowed. Now, my father was never a prisoner of the Japanese, but I've said before that he operated on Japanese-held islands behind their lines. And he was wounded by the Japanese, and he killed Japanese, as I found out right towards the end of his life. I've mentioned that half of his war record is still marked never to be released. And that on this particular night, we were crossing over Swanston Street, going towards Young and Jackson's hotel, and there were 2 Japanese sailors standing on the corner, looking at a map, obviously of the city of Melbourne. And you could see people avoiding them, giving them wide berth. Now, my father walked up and spoke Japanese. I never knew that he'd spoken Japanese. And he asked them what they were looking for, and they wanted to go to the Victorian Museum because there was a display of Japanese imperial pottery there. Now, this was late at night or early evening, so the museum would have been shut, and they were obviously wanting to get directions so the next day or whenever they could go there. And I said to my father as we were travelling home, I didn't know you could speak Japanese, Dad. I've never heard you speak it. And he said, and I was only 14 at the time, and he said, oh, there's lots of things you don't know. And then my next question was, you were wounded by them. You were involved. I didn't know at that stage. I didn't know till he told me when I was 19 that he'd been involved in executing what we call exterminating with extreme prejudice today. And I said, so you don't have any hatred of the Japanese? And I knew some of his friends did, because he had a close friend who'd come and have a meal with us every Anzac Day who'd been on the Burma Railway and had survived it. And he bitterly hated the Japanese. And I'll never forget, my father's words stayed in my mind. He said, I realised that if I didn't forgive, hatred is like a cancer, and it would kill me, it would eat away at me. Mm-hmm. And I had just got married, I had my first child, then my second child, then my third child, you. What type of a human, and he suffered PTSD, what kind of a father, of a husband, and a member of post-war Melbourne community would I be? And he said, no, hatred is like cancer.
Yes.
And you have to get it out of your system. And there I witnessed him helping these two young Japanese sailors, talking to them, and I can still see them turning to him and smiling and bowing their heads and saying, hi, which I understand is Japanese for yes.
Yes.
And he obviously asked them, do you understand what I have said? And so he was a good example of what those two Jewish women, some 10 years later, showed me. So forgiveness is a powerful thing, but as you say, it doesn't just spring up out of nowhere.
No.
It has to have a process.
And you do need to deal with the emotions of the original issues that caused you to have a problem, for want of a better term. And so there's an emotional component, there's a logical component,
yes,
and then there is the realisation. And to me, as you say, it is a cancer. You can sit there and devote your rest of your life to what that transgression was, or the issue was, and how terrible it was, or you can choose to move past that.
Well, look at Osama bin Laden, the last crusade was 1295. And yet he still called the West the Crusaders.
Yes.
And he still made it clear when they'd publish in the West a film of him holding an AK-47 Kalashnikov. It became quite apparent of his hatred of the West.
Yes.
Even though he'd benefited from it, coming from a wealthy Saudi Arabian family, he'd been there, he'd seen it. But that hatred became such a cancer in him that it ate away and led to the Twin Towers tragedy.
Yes.
So I think you're right again when you say that forgiveness involves emotion, intellect, reflectiveness, common sense.
Yes.
And one of the most important aspects, I think, is survival insanity. You survive sane. Because I've met a few people in the law who I acted for and had colleagues acting for who were caught up, had committed crimes and were caught up with hatred. Mm. And to hear those people speak, they were on the verge of insanity.
Yes.
It had turned them into an nearly insane beast.
Oh, wow. Okay. That's an interesting observation. I must admit, you can see it at times with prejudices towards certain cultures or colours of skins or religions. So those sort of things. And it's almost a jealousy at times when you actually ask them what's the root cause. The root cause is, they get all the money and basically don't do anything with it. Or, their religion will only only deal with themselves, and that's why their religion is so rich. They hoard money. Well, good luck to them,
Well,
right?
I read an interesting thing this morning. It was written by an atheist who said, what is it with... They were commenting on this young Muslim boy stabbing the Assyrian bishop. And the atheist comment was, what is with religion that it causes these great divides? Because you never hear about one group of atheists attacking another group of atheists and wanting to kill them.
Yes.
And I thought, look,
That's probably a good...
in the jocularity of that statement, there is a certain truth, isn't there?
And what is it? I mean, at the end of the day, freedom of religion means that if that's your beliefs and that's what you choose to walk down the path of, why is it that somebody else's religion has to be?
Well, religion, of course, encourages passion.
Yes,
now,
it does.
I'm a Christian, and I'm passionate about the life of the Galilean carpenter and what he did and the stories in the Bible. I was raised from the age of 3 in Miss Beulah's Sunday school class for infants. But my passion for Christianity does not make me want to or diminish a Buddhist or a Hindu or a Muslim. In fact, it makes me find, well, we've got some things in common.
Sure.
Not so much with the Buddhists, because that's more of a philosophy, but with a Jewish person and with a Muslim, you know, and Islam speaks, and that those three faiths are people of the book.
Yes.
And the book, of course, being the Old Testament, the New Testament, and the Quran.
What interests me is the parallels. There are some similar ethical components, and
Yes.
then there are some that are mutually exclusive.
Yes, you're right. And so you can be passionate about Islam, passionate about Judaism, passionate about Christianity, but you've got to be, I think, responsible, mature enough and aware enough not to let your passion for what you believe in to say we're right and everyone else is wrong, and what happened in the Inquisition. So we're going to make you... I wonder how many Christians today can trace their history back to Jewish people in the late 1500s in Europe who became Christian to avoid being executed under the Inquisition.
I've spent a bit of time only because you raised the right and wrong component and looking at the human condition, and there does seem to be an affliction with certain people that do have to be right.
Yes.
And absolutely have to be right. And again, when you draw it into some of our other problems with respect to race and religion,
yes,
you can see how this can be exactly what we're saying.
You're so right, and it's so important to, if you ever feel that you have to be right, accept that, have I ever been wrong before in my life? And I wonder how many listeners out there, if I ask them the question, have you ever been wrong in your life? Anyone who said to me, no, I never have, I'd be very doubtful. So it's that. See, here's where you quite rightly spoke about the process of forgiveness. Because once you realize that something might be right for me, it feels right, it ticks all my boxes in terms of faith or whatever, but it may not do it for someone else.
Correct.
In fact, atheism might be their choice.
Yes.
Or again, other religions, Sikhism might be. So just let it go. Accept that we don't all think the same. And again, my final point on it, how many people have you met, Colin, given that you're not an identical twin, how many people have you met in your 49 years, is it?
Yes,
that have
52.
Just looked exactly like you, thought exactly like you, and you've realised, I'm just meeting a clone.
Very rarely. Very rarely.
Never. Even identical twins.
I wouldn't say exactly, but look, you can have commonality of thought. You can have commonality of views. You can have those things. But again, you often find that there's some diversions or slight variations to the way it is.
But you used a key word. You said commonality. I asked identicality, if you like.
There isn't.
You've never met anyone who's identical.
No, and it's funny.
And that should really be the reminder. before you want to speak, before you want to act, just stop and think again.
Yes.
Be careful.
Yes. And that is the point in a nutshell. All right, we're at the end of the program, David. A bit of a summary.
Well, forgiveness. It's a hard thing to do, but I think the key in everything of my 74 years of seeing people who have forgiven is they're set free.
Yes.
They are set free from the binding and the burden of hating.
I think that's that negativity and positivity component in life,
yes.
and negativity can be all-consuming.
Oh, definitely, yes.
All right, David Ashton-Lewis, thank you very much for your time again this morning.
Thank you very much for having me.
You've been listening to 4CRB's interviews and talkback series. Support local online content and become a financial supporter today at 4CRB.com.